Hello. Yes, good morning to everybody. We will start our session. So, I will call the first speaker, Dr. Kushal Umesh Bhai Agrawal. Yes, welcome. Start your presentation.
Hello. Thank you, AIOC, for giving me this opportunity. I'm Dr. Kushal Agrawal. I'm ocular oncologist practicing in Ahmedabad, Gujarat. This presentation is from my fellowship time at Wells Eye Hospital. So, today my topic of presentation is ultra low dose radiotherapy in cytology proven primary uveal lymphoma. So, a background of my presentation is usually um, there is a trend of lymphoma being treated with the ultra low dose radiation. Traditionally, we treat any lymphoma with around 34 to 36 gray radiation, but recently mesenchymal lymphoma has been treated with the 4 gray of radiation instead of 36 gray radiation, and there is some evidence of orbital lymphoma being treated with 4 gray of radiation. So we implemented same thing in the uveal lymphoma. So purpose is to study effect of ultra low dose radiotherapy, which is also called boom boom radiotherapy, using 4 gray of radiation in patient with fine needle aspiration biopsy proven primary uveal lymphoma. It is retrospective interventional case series, 8 eyes of 8 consecutive patients with fine needle aspiration biopsy proven primary uveal lymphoma were included in the study. Patient with associated systemic lymphoma already treated with the external beam radiation or systemic immunochemotherapy were excluded. So each patient with the presumed diagnosis of choroidal lymphoma underwent a 27 gauge needle assisted fine needle aspiration biopsy through transvitreal route, and on cytopathology, once it was confirmed to be lymphoma, patients were treated with the 4 gray of radiation. So total 8 patients were there, mean age of 66 years. Only choroidal involvement was present in 4 patients, while other patients were having ciliary body plus conjunctival involvement as well. FNAB confirmed diagnosis of choroidal lymphoma in all cases. This is one case when top images, all 3 images showing the pre-radiotherapy images, where you can see this infiltration of this fundus diffusely with the lymphoma cells, suspected lymphoma cells, and then when we pass OCT through that, you see classical lumpy bumpy appearance of the choroid, which is one of the classical OCT features of the lymphoma. And the choroid is diffusely thickened. You cannot even see surface of the sclera. And there is on ultrasound also there is diffuse choroidal thickening you see. So this patient was treated with the 4 gray of radiation, and you can see resolution of the lymphoma cells, and the choroid thickness is also reduced. The lumpy bumpy appearance has gone. You can see scleral shadow, and the ultrasound thickness has also reduced. So best corrected visual acuity at the end of the study improved from 20 by 50 to 20 by 30 with statistically significant p-value. And this orange line is showing number of eyes with the subretinal fluid at presentation, which has almost reduced at the end of the study, and also intraretinal fluid, which was 5 eyes, and that has been reduced with the study. And the ultrasound choroidal thickness, as you see in each case, has reduced significantly with the p-value of 0.03. It has reduced from 3.1 to 1.9 millimeter pre-radiotherapy and post-radiotherapy. So outcome measures were best corrected visual acuity improved from 20 by 50 to 20 by 30. Mean ultrasound choroidal thickness improved from 3.1 millimeter to 1.9 millimeter. And change in the cystoid, change in the central macular thickness at fovea with therapy improved from 371 to 263 microns. So each value was significant. So mean follow-up was 32.4 months. OCT surface undulation came to normal within 6.9 months. None of the patient had visual acuity loss greater than 3 lines post radiation, and no major radiation complications were there in any patient. One patient had recurrence after 36 months, and this patient was treated with the standard dose radiation. So each patient was treated with the 4 gray radiation, and if patient is having any recurrence, then patient shifted to 30 gray radiation, and only one patient had this type of outcome. So we compared our study with the other published study. So Kosik et al. And Ganam et al. Has published on lymphoma, and they all treated with 33 gray or 28 gray radiation, while we treated with the 4 gray of radiation. So we can see cataract, radiation retinopathy, and vision deterioration all were there present in their study, but none of the patient developed any complication in our study, but recurrence rate was high, but that can be managed with the increasing dose of radiation. So to conclude, ultra low dose radiation can be considered as a first line treatment with less side effects in patient with the primary uveal lymphoma, and recurrence can be treated with increasing dose of radiation. Thank you.
Okay. What is the normal thickness of choroid?
So choroid is usually 200 to 300 microns. So in our many of the cases it has like average was 3.1 millimeters. So it was diffuse choroidal thickening in case of the lymphoma.
So with minimum radiation of 4, you have not got any simple complication.
No, so we did not get any major complication like radiation papillopathy, radiation retinopathy. So we did not get, because it is a very low dose of radiation, and lymphoma cells are very like sensitive to radiation. That's why now there is a trend of treating lymphoma cells with ultra low dose radiation. Even mesenchymal lymphoma has been treated now with ultra low dose radiation, so to prevent radiation complications.
Which type of lymphoma you are getting more in your case?
Can you please repeat your question?
Which types of lymphomas
Huh.
you are having with in all cases?
So primarily they were uveal lymphoma. Involvement of the choroid and ciliary body was the primary site, and some patients were associatedly having conjunctival lymphoma. We did not take any orbital lymphoma in our study. So primary was the uveal lymphoma.
Only the ciliary lymphomas you have treated.
Yes, yes, yes.
Had a conjunctival component,
Which component?
a conjunctival component.
2 patients were having
Two of the
conjunctival.
patients. So the biopsy was again from the uvea, or was it from the conjunctiva?
In that patient, we took from conjunctival.
From the conjunctiva. Okay. The other thing is your follow-up range is quite large.
Yes. It is
So you have your first recurrence at 36 months, and your shortest follow-up is at 9 months.
correct.
So, I mean, advocating boom radiotherapy.
Yes, sir. So still we
yeah.
are following these patients, and long-term result we will publish again,
Yeah,
sir.
because we were all
Yeah.
very excited about boom radiotherapy. The problem is with the recurrences.
Yes, correct, sir.
Okay. Nice presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Dr. Sukanya
Pradeep.
Padi.
Dr. Padi is here? No?
Dr. Sukanya, is she present? Not. Okay. The next speaker, Dr. Narayan Balkrishnan. Is he here?
Dr. Basak.
Ah, yes.
Who's presenting?
Acute tumor metabolomics, key to complications in cataract and glaucoma.
I think my presentation is not up.
Ah, yes.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Rohan Basak from Chennai, and today I'd like to share my study, aqueous humor metabolomics in pseudoexfoliation syndrome, key to complications in cataract and glaucoma. To begin with, I have no financial interest to disclose. Pseudoexfoliation syndrome is a multi-organ inflammatory disorder with deposition of grayish-white flecks of basement membrane-like granulofibrillar material in various ocular structures. Although its origin is unknown, its looming presence heralds serious complications like cardio and cerebrovascular disorder, dementia, and sensory neural hearing loss, among other ocular problems.
Please help him change the slide. Okay.
Our aim was to compare the aqueous humor composition in patients with and without pseudoexfoliation syndrome. This was a prospective case control study at a tertiary care hospital in Chennai from December 22 to May 23, enrolling about 22 patients with and 22 without the disease. Adults consenting for cataract surgery were included, and those with pseudoexfoliation syndrome were added as cases with appropriate age-match controls. Those with existing glaucomatous changes, connective tissue, and metabolic disorders were excluded. After enrollment, 0.2 ml of aqueous humor was collected during the surgery and metabolites assessed using quantitative ELISA. The analysis was done using the CV ANOVA test. As the results go, there was no statistical difference noted between the mean age and the genders of both cases and controls. Majority of the patients with pseudoexfoliation syndrome were found to have nuclear sclerosis grade 3 cataract, as opposed to those without the disease, with a nuclear sclerosis grade 2 with a posterior subcapsular cataract. On analysis of metabolites among the cases and controls, the XFS patients showed a significantly higher mean values of ergothioneine, indole acetic acid, and hydroxyantranilic acid, probably indicating their minor role in zonular metabolism, whereas the non-XFS patients had low values of serine and nitric oxide. Detailed metabolite comparison revealed significant differences in the levels of all amino acids except the previous mentioned three, which is ergothioneine, indole acetic acid, and hydroxyantranilic acid, with the XFS patients having lower levels of all amino acids in general as compared to their controls. The most significant reduction, though, was noted with homocysteine, with a p-value of 0.001. Understanding the XFS pathogenesis helps in unraveling how the complications unfold. In keeping with previous studies, significant reduction of 7 key metabolites used in the cysteine, methionine, arginine, and proline metabolism was noted in our study, thus pointing to their paucity for crucial processes like the zonular metabolism and antioxidation processes. To conclude, pseudoexfoliation syndrome appears to be caused by increased oxidative stress, and identification of causative metabolites may help in innovation of drugs to delay its complications. Like any other study, our study too has room for improvement. This study recruited few participants and was restricted to a small area, interfering with its generalization. There was no assessment of complications, and the gold standard test for analysis, which is liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry, was not used in view of financial constraints. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, all. Myself is Dr. Timmy Francis Chandy. I'm a postgraduate in Madurai Medical College. And it's a small study, it's a comparative study on RNFL ganglion cell complex thickness and optic nerve head morphology in early thyroid eye disease using SDOC. Now, as we all know, thyroid eye disease is an autoimmune inflammatory orbital illness and is most frequently unilateral or causing unilateral or bilateral proptosis. Of these, 90% of them are caused by Graves' hyperthyroidism. And the presentation is typically occurring in the 4th to 5th decades. And we can assess this patient using thyroid function tests and the ocular signs available. Now, orbital inflammation and edema leads to increased retinal nerve fiber layer thickness in early stages. As we all know, the severity of thyroid eye disease shows a hyperbolic curve called the Randolph's curve, and it is an early this we can pick up using RNFL thickness, which is also an early indicator of disc edema. This usually follows axonal loss, thinning of RNFL and optic atrophy due to inflammation, which can be detected early using OCT, which is indeed a useful tool to assess optic nerve dysfunction at an early stage. Now, the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study is to compare the changes in RNFL, ganglion cell complex thickness, and optic nerve head morphology in early thyroid eye disease using spectral domain optical coherence tomography, and to analyze these parameters in early thyroid disease and its relation to severity of orbital disease, and therefore to establish these changes to detect early optic nerve dysfunction in early thyroid disease. Now, coming to the materials and methods, the study design employed was of a comparative cross-sectional study, and the duration of the study was 1 year. The sample size taken was 50, out of which 25 were cases and 25 controls. And the study setting was Department of Ophthalmology, Government Rajaji Hospital, Madurai. The study population included individuals more than 15 years with early thyroid disease and evaluated as exophthalmos less than 3 mm and high free T4, T3 and T4 values. Those on anti-thyroid drugs were excluded. Ethical and other informed consent were taken prior to the study. The retinal nerve fiber layer thickness, ganglion cell complex, and other optic nerve head morphology, such as disc area, cup disc ratio, were as explored using OCT, which used spectral domain. And then the data collected were all collected and prepared as a master stat and assessed using SPSS 16 software. Now, coming to the results, as in any other previous studies, the mean age group was between 41 to 50 years, and of all the cases, active cases were only 44% and inactive were 56%. And about 68% were bilateral. Now, coming to the main point, that is the RNFL thickness showed an increase in cases compared to controls, whereas in active cases, there had been an increase, a significant increase, a statistically significant increase in active cases as well. In this 25 hypothyroid cases with early thyroid eye disease evaluated were compared with 25 normal subjects, and the mean age group of the study was within the 4th to 5th decade of life with a female preponderance, which were all corroborated with other earlier studies. And of these, 32% of cases has history of cigarette smoking. Now, the retinal fiber layer thickness were measured in each quadrant using STOCT. As you all can see, the superior quadrant cases showed an increase by approximately 20 points, and inferior also showed an increase in number of in the cases in nasally and temporally, and the mean also showed more values on the case side. Now, coming to other parameters like the ganglion cell thickness, optic nerve morphology, they were less significant statistically, as these thickness among cases was 64.44 micrometers, whereas among controls it was 67.46, it was less significant. And there was no significant changes in disc area or cup area and cup disc ratio. So the only main parameter which showed some significant change was retinal fiber layer thickness. So to conclude, the RNFL thickness is increased in cases when compared to controls, and also in active cases when compared to inactive cases. This was attributed to the ongoing inflammation in retinal fiber layers in early stages of disease, and this can be used to pick up cases early.
Thank you, doctor. Nice presentation.
Hello.
Can you define how you define early thyroid eye disease? Do you use any validated scoring system?
Yes, ma'am. Clinical activity score. With
Sorry.
that, we used exophthalmometer, exophthalmometer. We less than 3 mm proptosis we included in the study, ma'am. Then free T3, T4 values were assessed.
No,
And
to gauge the activity
severity
of
of
thyroid eye
disease.
disease,
Disease,
we
ma'am.
have clinical activity score or a visa score. Did you use any of
we
the
used clinical activity score, ma'am,
clinical activity
to differentiate between active and inactive cases, ma'am.
Right.
So
So
more
what
than
was your
3.
definition of early thyroid eye disease? Till which point did you put the patients in early stage?
Ma'am, from the point of diagnosis to the point of treatment, ma'am.
No. So
How you are diagnosed early cases of
what is the
thyroid
definition
eye
of early in
disease?
your study?
Less than 3
than
clinical
3.
points, ma'am.
So you have studied only hyperthyroid cases,
Yes.
not hypothyroid.
No, sir.
Why?
He's taking thyroid.
Now in a study only high values came, sir, with significant high signs, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now the next speaker is Dr. Usha.
So I'll be talking about genetics and all we need to know. Common intraocular pediatric cancer, as you all know, retinoblastoma, the incidence is about 1,500 new cases per year in the country, and at AECs we see about 60 to 80 new cases per year. 40% is heritable, and early identification of RB will help in saving life, globe and vision. So the questions that are asked by the parents are, will the proband's vision be affected? Will one or more, both eyes be affected? What is the cause of this disease? Will the next child be affected with retinoblastoma? The answers to the above is the genetics of retinoblastoma. RB is the gatekeeper model. It's because of this gene that helps in control of the proliferation of cancer cells. Now, retinoblastoma is caused by alterations in gene RB1 that protects the cells from becoming a tumor. 2 alterations are required for developing retinoblastoma. The heritable one affects mostly both eyes. Sometimes it could be one eye as well. High risk of other cancers are possible in this scenario. Increased risk of RB in siblings and as well as the offsprings is noticed. Usually alterations are identified in the blood also. Non-heritable ones affects only one eye. There's no risk of other cancers. There is a reduced risk of RB in siblings and offsprings. Usually alterations identified in the tumor. So this is the process through which the entire screening is done. We do a sequential mutation screening, and it is a cost-effective analysis where it was established stepwise, where we did the Sanger sequencing for point mutations and MLPA for deletions and duplications. And we also did some epigenetic studies, MS-MLPA for promoter methylation. The test sensitivity has been 95% for somatic mutations in RB tumor and 90% in germline mutations in bilateral RB. Based on this, we did a lot of cost control, and it has been brought down from $1,800 to $150. So if you look at the extrapolation and clinical scenario, here we have a child who was brought in early, 4 months, and the mother's right eye was enucleated. Subsequent follow-up, the mother was pregnant. The 12-day-old sibling was brought to the clinic, that is the next child, was brought to the clinic. It was found to be group B, retinoblastoma, both eyes, and the patient had to be treated early, and the vision and the eye were salvaged. 2 similar looking twins, no family history of RB, no mutation in parents' blood. One patient had de novo germline mutation in the blood, and the other one did not have any mutation in the blood, which ruled out a retinoblastoma. Here the proband presented at 36 months. There was no family history. Unilateral RB group E, germline mutation was identified in blood, which insists that screening should be done in unilateral patients as well. Proband was brought at 26 months, group E, right eye, germline mutation identified, and closely monitored, patient turned bilateral during the treatment period. Analysis of the parents showed the father as an unaffected carrier, predicted risk for the next sibling. Proband's wife was 2 months pregnant, familial RB with 4 affected members. Proband and mother had heterozygous deletion of exons 3 to 13. Family wanted to know the risk of RB in the growing embryo. Prenatal testing done by excuse me, amniocentesis, and same deletion was found in the fetal DNA. So the risk of RB in offspring, left eye enucleation done at 6 months of age for retinoblastoma, no mutation found in patient blood, and less chance of getting RB in the offspring. Left eye enucleated age 2, no history of RB, non-consanguineous family, no mutation identified in blood, so no risk of developing secondary tumor. So genetics plays an important role in clinical management of retinoblastoma. Our translational research made the genetic testing affordable. We have touched the lives of more than 500 families, 2,120 samples through genetic testing and counseling. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very nice presentation, madam.
Madam, what kind of sequencing is being done for your patient? Whole genome or?
Yeah, so in cases where only exome was necessary, we would do exome. So that's why we do a stepwise so that we can do a cost control as well. So we do exome and then whole genome sequencing as well. We do have the NGS, then we go for epigenetics, we go to do the MLPA, and then we do the methylation specific MS-MLPA also. With the, both, not only with the blood samples, with the tumor samples wherever necessary. So it's not only done for our institution, it is being extended for other institutions as well.
And what do you do for unilateral tumors?
Unilateral tumors, usually we start off with the blood and the family screening. It's not done just for the proband, it's done generally for the family as well. And we do the screening for the unilateral cases as well, and in few of the cases we did find mutations. So I think in future we'll have to insist for genetic testing even in unilateral cases.
Do you also look at MYC and?
Yes, MYC amplifications, copy number variations, we do all of those.
Okay.
And we did find increase in copy number. More than 10 copy numbers have been increased in specific in that gene, MYC, and we've seen that in 3 of our patients as well, which means it's not heritable, it is somatic. Thank you. So we've so the cost for usually elsewhere, I think they're the only center right now doing for the entire range of sequencing. The cost in the US is $1,800, which is available in the US, and the cost at our center is about $150, which is 16,000 rupees for the entire family, which could include any number of siblings. So we normally calculate for at least 2 siblings and parents, but if there's a whole pedigree, we also do it for them at the same cost. And for those who cannot afford, we are doing it free of cost now.
Thank you, ma'am.
Now the next speaker, Dr. Shirali Gokaru.
After that we'll go back to सर ये आई हुई है तो ये पेज खत्म होने तक इनको बुला लेते हैं.
Yes.
Good morning to all the dignitaries. I'll be talking about the treatment compliance in retinoblastoma patients and approach to identifying barriers, intervening and assessing compliance. As we know that retinoblastoma is the commonest intraocular tumor in children and has a low survival rate, especially in the developing countries. But since it's a curable tumor, studies have been done to look for the reasons of non-compliance, but there is a paucity of information regarding the interventions done to overcome it. So my study aims to identify in retinoblastoma patients the treatment compliance rate, the barriers to treatment compliance and the role of interventions in improving the compliance. It's a retrospective comparative study wherein all the newly diagnosed and treated retinoblastoma patients during the period of July 2019 to June 2022 were included, and the treatment non-compliance was taken as a failure to complete therapy or missing their treatment for a period of 4 weeks or beyond. So as a hospital protocol, in the initial period, we used to provide certain allowances for the basic treatment and diagnostic, but later on from 2021, the hospital started providing allowances for some advanced treatment, advanced outsourced diagnostics, providing grants for travel, accommodation, food, as well as had a provision of a dedicated retinoblastoma counselor with a 24-hour helpline services. So based on these interventions, we divided the group into 2 groups, the study period. The group 1 had 60 patients who received only the baseline interventions, and group 2 had 86 patients who received additional interventions. And the barriers that were identified in both of the groups were then further categorized as per the WHO's dimensions of adherence as patient-related, therapy-related, condition-related, health-related or socio-economic factors. When we compare the results of the 2 groups, they were comparable, socio-economic data was comparable, but demographically the patients coming from the rural area or traveling a distance more than 100 kilometers were more in group 2. But otherwise the cancer stage at presentation and tumor literality was comparable. And if we look at the treatment compliance rate, so the treatment compliance rate in group 1 was 40 out of 60 patients, that is 67%, and 67 out of 86 patients, that is 78% in group 2. And if we look at the barriers, overall barriers, so the commonest barrier came out was the socio-economic barrier, followed by the condition-related barrier, which included the advice of enucleation, followed by patient-related barriers, then the least common being the health-related and the therapy-related, which included some chemotherapy-related side effects. And so if we look at the overall compliance rate, so what we observed in our study was that 67% was the rate in group 1, which increased to 77.9, nearly 78% in group 2. And when we compare with the studies done in the past, they have calculated the maximum, like the range of compliance was calculated by 47 to 67%. So in our study, the point that came out was that the increase in compliance rate to up to 78% was despite being the COVID lockdown, patients missing their appointments, having advanced stage at their presentation, still we could increase the compliance rate. This was mainly because of a dedicated retinoblastoma team, as well as the best financial support and the counseling that we continue to give to these patients. But the most important question is, what about the cohort of patients who, despite receiving all the interventions, are non-compliant? So this is the most important thing that comes out of the study, and the reasons being certain social disbeliefs which persist in our country, that still patients are not able to come to the medical facility on time. They present at a later stage, and therefore what I recommend from my study is that we have to have a better awareness campaigns at a primary level, and as well as we need to have better financial supports for this. We need to have some provisions by which the institutes can have better NGO collaborations and better fundraising for such treatment of such patients. So these are my acknowledgements, and thank you.
So what do you think about your presentation?
I think this is a very important study, sir, as such, to bring out that how the compliance rate is actually improved if we continue giving the financial support to most of the patients and continue having counseling. Because the most important point in my study was we had a very great counseling team. Counseling team as in who has a 24-hour helpline number, as in when patient have a difficulty, patient has any symptoms, we are always there to receive their calls, help them, arrange for them, even the conveyances or everything for the hospital, and that has actually helped us in improving the compliance. Though patient had interruptions, but they did had a completion in their treatment. So this is what I would
The
like to
22% who didn't comply even after providing
Yes,
everything. So
yes.
how many of them were destined for enucleation, or all of them were advised enucleation?
So out of 22%, almost 18% of patients were those who were actually advised for enucleation because their stage of presentation was such. And the most important, the reason for this was because of the COVID lockdown. Patients had, after the COVID, when patient descended in 2021, there was, they were actually a compliant patient, but then they missed their appointment, and so that was the reason.
Thank you.
Important.
Good presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Now again I will call Dr. Sukanya Padi. Is she here? Ah, yes. You can present now.
Your presentation is here.
On this side.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be speaking on the topic ocular complications in dengue hemorrhagic fever. Dengue fever is a mosquito-borne illness prevalent mainly in the tropics. It is feared for causing the dengue hemorrhagic spectrum of the disease, leading to significant morbidity and mortality. Its rarer manifestations are categorized as the expanded dengue syndrome. The involvement of the eye in dengue fever is one such phenomenon. Aim of my study is to describe a series of sight-threatening ocular and adnexal involvement associated with dengue hemorrhagic fever. It's a retrospective, non-comparative case series. Medical records of patients who presented with ocular symptoms attributed to dengue hemorrhagic fever were reviewed. Demography presenting features were recorded. 29 eyes of 23 patients were included. Bilateral ocular involvement was seen in 6 patients. The mean age range was 14 to 81 years. Coexistent diabetes mellitus and enteric fever were present in 3 patients. History of blood transfusion was present in 9, and thrombocytopenia in 8 patients at the time of presentation with ocular complaints. Presenting features included endophthalmitis in 11, panophthalmitis in 10, orbital cellulitis with panophthalmitis in 4, isolated corneal or scleral melt in 3, orbital hemorrhage with panophthalmitis in 1 patient. This is the gender predisposition of my graph. Female being 5 and male being 18 patients. Ocular involvement was seen in 6 patients bilaterally and 17 patients unilaterally. Systemic conditions were present, as such hypertension, diabetes mellitus, thyroid. Dengue-related complications were seen in acute kidney injury, polycerositis, ascites, thrombocytopenia, and blood transfusion. More than 20 by 1200 visual acuity was seen in uh, 3 patients, and more than 2 patients were showing close to face presentation, and hand movement was positive in 2 patients. 7 patients showed PL positive and 17 patients showed no PL positive. The clinical features were decreased vision, eye pain, redness, watering and discharge. Presenting signs were extraocular movement limitations, corneal infiltrations, proptosis, scleral melt, anterior uveitis, cataract and vitreous exudates, retinal detachment. These are some of the findings seen in our patients. To conclude, dengue fever can present with devastating, sight-threatening ocular and adnexal inflammation. The mechanism of dengue-related ocular complications remain unclear and less well understood than the systemic manifestations of the disease. It can only be hypothesized that the fulminant inflammation is a complex interplay between the virus-mediated cellular destruction and hemodynamic alterations, as well as the host's immune response, with a possible component of superimposed microbial infection. Thank you.
All these complications are late complications.
Yeah.
So what early complications?
Early complications as in subconjunctival hemorrhage and watering and irritation. We saw some.
So all the patients, those who are suffering from dengue fever, they are getting subconjunctival hemorrhages and all these panophthalmitis.
No, it was a late complication, and it mainly depended on the host's immune response, and most of the patients we saw were IPD patients. They had previous complications, systemic complications. That's why they presented with such complications.
So there is a association of secondary infections with dengue.
Yes.
Then only you will get the panophthalmitis.
Yeah. Yes.
The pure dengue will not give you panophthalmitis.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Dr. Pati, you have any microbiological workup on these patients who had panophthalmitis or endophthalmitis?
Microbiological study were done in some patients and some were not followed up.
Did you have a positive culture for bacteria?
Positive culture in some patients like aeruginosa were found.
Okay. Thank you.
Now the next speaker is Dr. Praneeth Telukanta. Dr. Praneeth.
Good morning, everyone. I will be presenting on diffuse choroidal hemangioma, clinical presentation and treatment outcomes. So, we all know that choroidal hemangioma, characterized as vascular hematomatous tumor, present in 2 distinct forms based on the extent of the choroidal involvement, that is circumscribed or diffuse. And diffuse choroidal hemangioma, we see that it is most commonly seen in conjunction with Sturge-Weber syndrome. The fundus findings varies from either loss of choroidal markings to exudative retinal detachment with choroidal thickening, and it is also associated with secondary glaucoma. So before proceeding with my study, I would like to show about a single case. So this is the clinical picture of a 12-year-old female patient who presented to us with complaints of diminution of vision in the right eye since the last 3 months. So like even on the external examination, we see that the characteristic port wine stain involving all 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve. And on the top right image, we see there is exudative retinal detachment, and also you see that tomato red appearance under that. That also suggests like goes in favor of choroidal hemangioma. So in the bottom right image, it is the B-scan ultrasound. We see low to medium to high intensity echo in the mid-vitreous cavity that is suggestive of a retinal detachment. And posterior to that, you see a globular mass that is homogeneous and mid to high intensity echoes suggestive of this diffuse choroidal hemangioma. So she underwent external beam radiotherapy, And we see in the serial fundus photographs that there is resolution of both the exudative retinal detachment and also the diffuse choroidal hemangioma. So the aim of this study was to describe clinical characteristics and treatment outcomes of patients diagnosed with diffuse choroidal hemangioma and Sturge-Weber syndrome. So this was a retrospective study and recruited patients who presented at the clinic in between October 2012 to March 2022, and patients with diagnosis of diffuse choroidal hemangioma were included. And the diagnosis was based on the results of clinical examination, B-scan ultrasound and optical coherence tomography. The demography, treatment details and functional outcomes in the form of visual acuity and intraocular pressure, and anatomical outcomes in the form of resolution of the retinal detachment and reduction in the tumor height were noted. So 32 eyes of 29 patients were included in the study, and 15 eyes involved were right, and 18% of the patients had bilateral involvement. So the main presenting features were blurred vision that was seen in 84% of the patients, and facial discoloration in 15% of the patients. There was dilated and tortuous episcleral veins that was seen in 37.5% of the patients, and port wine stain was present in 75% of the patients, and 56% of the patients presented with exudative retinal detachment. So there are even in the diffuse choroidal hemangioma, 4 of the patients presented with a focal nodularity. The baseline mean tumor height of the patients was 4.9 millimeters, and the mean largest basal diameter was 10.7 millimeters. So the patients underwent either radiation or non-radiation therapy. So in radiation therapy, they underwent external beam radiotherapy and plaque brachytherapy, in which ruthenium plaque was used. And this flowchart shows the functional outcomes. We see that the visual acuity actually decreased from 1.09 to 1.39. And in these patients who underwent this radiation therapy, 25% of the patients needed TRAP and 16% patients needed AGMs due to the secondary glaucoma. And those who underwent other therapies like transpupillary thermotherapy and orbital propranolol, again the vision was dropped, but we see that the number of complications, like patients who needed TRAB and TSCPC, that is due to secondary glaucoma, were more. So in the anatomical outcomes, there is a reduction in the mean tumor height of 5.76 to 5.53 in the external beam radiotherapy, and 3.17 to 3 millimeter in the plaque brachytherapy. And in the other treatment group, it was 3.35 to 2.14 millimeter. So this study describes the clinical features of patients with diffuse choroidal hemangioma and the treatment outcomes with different modalities that they underwent. The demographics, presenting visual symptoms, and clinical and imaging features were consistent with those described in the other studies in literature. So a mean follow-up was 94 months, and complete regression was seen in 37% of the patients, and partial regression was seen in 12% of the patients. So on an average, the tumor thickness was reduced to 2.85, and no significant change in the best corrected visual acuity, as I had mentioned earlier. The mean apex radiation dose was 40 gray, which was similar to previous studies. However, the mean dose reported in literature was 50 gray. So the limitations being a retrospective study and small sample size, and few of our patients had a missing imaging modality. To conclude, I would say that it is a rare intraocular tumor, and despite good tumor control and better anatomical outcomes, we see that the vision remains poor. So one thing that we need to take home from here is that we need to look for other features like CNS involvements and also for secondary glaucoma. Thank you.
Okay. So what is your aim?
My aim was to describe the clinical characteristics and the treatment outcomes of different modalities that were used in this study.
So all cases are of this Sturge-Weber syndrome?
Not all cases were of Sturge-Weber syndrome. So of the 32 eyes, 29 eyes were of Sturge-Weber syndrome.
And the other two? And the remaining?
That was not completely fitting into the criteria of Sturge-Weber syndrome.
Okay, but they had diffuse choroidal hemangiomas.
Yes, they had diffuse choroidal.
Okay. And the other interesting thing was your use of propranolol. So which were the selected cases where you used propranolol, and what was the outcome?
Doctor, actually the use of propranolol, it was not recent. It was the cases, as I mentioned earlier, we have included cases from 2012 to 2022. So the cases cases that were treated earlier, they were given propranolol. So in cases that were given propranolol, they were given a dose of 40 milligrams BD for 6 months.
Okay.
There was a reduction in the tumor height, but they had complications of secondary glaucoma, and more patients required trabeculectomy, and one patient actually required TSCPC in that case.
Among the patients who were treated with propranolol,
Yes.
was there any reduction in the exudative detachment, or that persisted with them?
There was partial regression. It was partial, not complete.
It was not complete regression. Thank you.
Thank you.
A very good morning to all. So I'll be presenting my paper on management strategy and outcomes in recurrent retinoblastoma. I have no financial disclosures or conflict of interest. I won't be scoring for the paper. We all know that retinoblastoma treatment has been evolved a long way from eye removal techniques to multimodal treatment modalities now we have for greater eye salvage and possible vision salvage. However, recurrence in retinoblastoma tumor is still a very critical concern in the post-treatment period. Intraocular recurrent disease has been documented in retina, vitreous, as well as the subretinal regions. The rates of new tumor development following all types of treatment have ranged from around 6% to 45% in literature. To just give an overview, systemic chemotherapy with focal treatment has reported 35 to 45% of recurrence rate. Systemic chemotherapy, without focal treatment, it has reported 35 to 45% of recurrence rate. Systemic chemotherapy along with focal treatment has reported around 18% of recurrence. Intraarterial chemotherapy and focal therapy has reported 9 to 23% of tumor recurrence. Our purpose was to determine the rate of intraocular recurrence and review the clinical profile, management, local as well as systemic outcomes in eyes with recurrent retinoblastoma. So this was a retrospective non-comparative case series. We included 22 eyes of 18 patients with retinoblastoma presenting with recurrence in the duration 2017 to 23. The inclusion criteria was, with classical definition of relapse in oncology, we did not take patients who showed a relapse of tumor within 6 months of stopping treatment, which the patients who recurred post 6 months of stopping prior treatment or after complete remission were included and labeled as recurrence and included in the study. The outcome variables were eye salvage, systemic metastasis, and survival rate. So in total of 142 eyes that we had treated in this duration of 121 patients with intraocular retinoblastoma, 22 eyes of 18 patients had intraocular recurrent retinoblastoma, making it a 6.7% of recurrence rate with our combination of treatment modalities. The mean age at presentation of these patients was 25 months. Male preponderance was noted. And majority of the tumors that recurred were unilateral, but we did have four cases who had recurrence in both the eyes alternately. Type of recurrence, solid retinal tumor recurrence was the highest, followed by recurrence of subretinal seeds and recurrence of vitreous seeds. So one of the eyes may have had one or more type of recurrent tissue. So the mean duration between remission and recurrence was around 7 months, the range being 2 to 30 months. The treatment modalities used for recurrent tumor treatment included systemic chemotherapy, intraarterial chemotherapy, intravitreal chemotherapy, transpapillary thermotherapy alone or in combination with cryotherapy, and plaque brachytherapy. So with all use of this multimodal treatment, we were able to salvage 12 or 55% of these eyes. 10 eyes underwent enucleation because of repeated recurrence and or risk of systemic metastasis. So at the mean follow-up of 36 months, no patients had detected systemic metastasis, and all now continue to be in remission. So a few examples. So this was the right-sided image shows solid tumor recurrence on the calcium mound after 6 months of remission, and the right-sided image shows the complete regression, status post systemic chemotherapy and combination of transpapillary thermotherapy. So this was a tumor which recurred with with vitreous seeds after 8 months of remission, and this worked with solid plus vitreous seeds. So what worked in these patients was systemic chemotherapy plus intravitreal chemotherapy with topotecan. So this patient had a solid tumor recurrence on a prior scar after 9 months of remission after having completed the 12 cycles of systemic chemotherapy for continuous relapse post-treatment. So we went ahead with intraarterial chemotherapy as a salvage treatment, and she did achieve complete regression. So we report 6.7% rate of tumor recurrence in intraocular retinoblastoma treated with combination of systemic chemotherapy and focal modalities. Recurrent solid tumor was 59%, vitreous seeds 23%, and subretinal seeds in 27% of eyes were diagnosed at the mean interval of 7 months. After utilizing multimodal treatment modalities, that is 55% of eyes were salvaged and 10 underwent enucleation. Thus, we report a 55% of eye salvage and 100% life salvage after a mean follow-up of 36 months in all our patients. Looking at literature, so recurrence has not been extensively published in literature. We have few bits and pieces of calculations from prior studies. So they do provide rates of retinal as well as vitreous seeds and subretinal seed recurrence after initial regression. And this particular review article provides guidelines for the treatment modalities, which were concurrent with what we had used. So due to lack of clear guidelines, management of recurrent retinoblastoma needs to be customized on case-to-case basis, and systemic and or intra-arterial chemotherapy can help in eye salvage, while secondary enucleation is still essential to reduce risk of local spread as well as systemic metastasis. Thank you for patient listening.
Thank you, madam. In all your patients, they are having bilateral retinoblastoma or unilateral?
No, sir. So these
it is
eyes,
not mentioned.
Yeah, so I did not completely, so because of lack of time, I did not include the at presentation data. So this clinical profile was at the time of recurrence. So the results were taken into account at the time of recurrence.
How many cycles you got this recurrence in unilateral cases and recurrence in bilateral cases?
Yes, so in 4 eyes, I had recurrence in bilateral cases in both the eyes at different point of time. And rest, that's why we have 18 patients and 22 eyes.
Okay.
Sunil, so you were talking about new tumors and you were talking about recurrences, which are not the same. So out of the patients that you presented, how many had new tumors after completing treatment
I did
versus
not calculate recurrent and new tumor separately, sir, because it is hard to define the new tumor from a subretinal seed, which has come up after the prior treatment. So that definition is a little blur with respect to retinoblastoma.
Thank you.
How you diagnose this recurrence in bilateral cases? After how many cycles?
Sir,
or it was already present?
Okay, so the recurrence was diagnosed after the child has been completely, the primary treatment has been completed, the tumor has been labeled regressed for a certain amount of time, at least 6 months. And at the time of close monitoring and follow-up evaluation, at the time if we notice a new tumor on the prior scar or new vitreous seeds or subretinal seeds, that is how the recurrence was labeled. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking on clinical profile and management outcomes of retinoblastoma patients presenting with orbital cellulitis. As we all know, retinoblastoma can masquerade as cellulitis in advanced intraocular and orbital stages. The inflammation is secondary to tumor necrosis, which leads to lid edema, proptosis, and other signs of orbital inflammation. Main clinical differential diagnosis is orbital cellulitis, which is infectious, and it can be diagnosed with thorough clinical and radiological examination. The primary objective of this study is to evaluate local recurrence, systemic metastasis, and survival rate in retinoblastoma patients presenting with orbital pseudocellulitis. The inclusion criteria was retinoblastoma patients with intraocular and orbital presentations who presented as orbital pseudocellulitis. It was a retrospective case series studies including 10 patients done from February 2018 to October 2023. Outcome variables were local and systemic metastasis with survival rate. All the patients underwent IV antibiotic and steroid treatment for symptomatic relief, further which they underwent systemic screening done by bone marrow biopsy and CSF cytology. Neuroimaging was done for all the patients that included MRI brain and orbit. Neoadjuvant chemotherapy was given standard or high doses for 6 cycles. Patients were re-imaged and underwent enucleation plus implant. All the patients underwent histopathological examination, out of which 4 showed high-risk factors. According to that, patients underwent adjuvant therapy, which included chemo and radio as well. So as results, the mean age of presentation of my patients was 34 months, which had male preponderance, with majority had unilateral cases, that was in 7 patients. The main symptom at presentation was eyelid edema, which was seen in all of the patients. Those were total 10 patients. 60% patients presented with intraocular RB and 40 presented with orbital RB. Intraocular RB, 33 patients had group E and 67% had group A with clinical risk factors. Optic nerve invasion was seen in 40% patients and systemic metastasis was seen in 30% patients. So the mean follow-up period of this study was 20 months. 9 patients underwent enucleation plus implant as 1 patient lost to follow-up after initial presentation. High risk factor was seen in 4 patients which included choroidal involvement, choroidal plus ciliary body involvement, optic nerve invasion. Systemic metastasis was seen in 3 patients, that is skeletal involvement, regional lymph node involvement and meningeal involvement, which was done by CSF cytology, which showed positive results. So overall survival of the patients, 78% patients were alive and are disease free, 11% patients are alive with active disease and 11% succumb to death. This is the overall results review. It is a clinical picture of a right-sided orbital RV but presented with orbital pseudocellulitis. MRI image of left-sided orbital RV presenting with pseudocellulitis with optic nerve extension. This is a 10-week-old female child who presented to us with left eye group E retinoblastoma with orbital pseudocellulitis. She underwent 6 cycles of standard dose of neoadjuvant chemotherapy, further which her left eye went into phthisis and its secondary enucleation was done. Last image is the image at 24 months of age with the customized ocular prosthesis. So overall, the most common presenting feature in patients with retinoblastoma and orbital pseudocellulitis is eyelid edema. Group E was seen in 2 patients and group E with CRF in 4. So overall, we report 30% systemic metastasis with 88% survival at mean follow-up of 20 months in patients of RV that presented with orbital pseudocellulitis. Agarwal and al. In 2004 studied over 4 patients of RV with orbital cellulitis, and after enucleation, all the 4 patients had high-risk factors. Waljinkar et al. In 2013 studied over 14 such patients, and out of which 10 underwent enucleation and HRF was seen as 4. Kaliki et al. In 2022 studied over 32 patients, all of them underwent enucleation and HRF was seen in 23 patients. In our study, we included 10 patients, out of which HRF was seen in 4, and patients alive with inactive disease are 7, with active disease is 1, and 1 succumbed to death. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that orbital cellulitis-like presentation of retinoblastoma can be misdiagnosed as an infective etiology. It is highly recommended that retinoblastoma should be kept as a differential whenever a child is presenting with orbital cellulitis, and all the children should undergo imaging because imaging modalities are the important tools which will lead to the confirmed diagnosis, optic nerve invasion or extraocular extension, and timely initiation of primary treatment can facilitate and help in overall salvage of the life.
Dr. Chaugule, sorry, I said Dr. Chaugule. Dr. Pachori, yeah, so you had 10 patients with orbital cellulitis, right? And so how many days of steroids did you give before you got the imaging done?
So at least 5 days IV antibiotics with 3 days steroids.
So why did you give antibiotics? Why did you give antibiotics?
For the symptomatic.
But you said these patients had pseudocellulitis.
So because patient had eyelid edema and pain also to reduce.
And that was because of sterile necrosis, right?
Yeah, to reduce those inflammation.
Okay. The second thing is, on imaging, how many patients had extraocular disease? First imaging. First imaging, yeah.
Yeah, 4 patients.
4 patients had extraocular disease and the remaining did not. Optic nerve invasion. Did anybody have orbital invasion?
At the time of presentation, no.
No. Okay. And how did you look at the high-risk factors for metastasis?
Sir, after enucleation on histopathological examination, we had choroidal involvement and we had ciliary body involvement and optic nerve invasion post-lamina.
In 4 patients only?
Yeah.
And this is after 6 cycles of chemotherapy?
Yes.
You've already downstaged the disease? Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I will call Dr. Rushali Shende.
This is how many years?
Good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking on the topic local and systemic outcomes in retinoblastoma eyes receiving pre-nucleation chemotherapy. So, as we all know, retinoblastoma is most common intraocular tumor in pediatric age group. Coming to the treatment modalities which we prescribe or we give in retinoblastoma these days are systemic, focal, and surgery. Systemic including chemotherapy, IVC and IAC, focal, transpupillary thermotherapy, cryotherapy, and in surgery, enucleation, either primary or secondary. So indication for neoadjuvant chemotherapy are for chemoreduction, vitreous seedings, and retinal detachment. It's also an initial treatment in patient of orbital and metastatic RB. Indication for primary enucleation are unilateral, international classification of international classification of retinoblastoma, group D or E tumors with nil visual prognosis, or unilateral group B with clinical risk factors, or the suspected choroidal or scleral or optic nerve extension. Fourth can be bilateral disease with one of group D or E tumor with NVP in one eye and the other with showing a small tumor of group A. Or it can be a thiazical eye presentation. So indication for secondary enucleation are recurrent or refractory RBs, eyes with media opacity, secondary glaucoma and tumor necrosis post-chemoreduction patients, thiazical eye post-chemoreduction, and orbital retinoblastoma. The purpose of my study is to evaluate the local recurrence and systemic metastasis in retinoblastoma eyes receiving pre-nucleation chemotherapy. It's a retrospective case series starting from January 2016 to December 2023 in 37 RB patients whose detailed retrospective chart review was done to study the demography, clinical features, radiological features, histopathological high-risk factors, local and systemic outcomes. My results showed there was a male preponderance of 23 patients. Majority of had shown sporadic inheritance pattern in 35 patients. Majority left eye was involved with 21 patients had the unilaterality. According to ICRB group, majority were presented in group E with clinical risk factors, 4 were in group D and 2 in group P. Radiological imaging at the presentation, majority had intraocular tumor, while 5 of them had orbital with optic nerve invasion and 1 with orbital with intracranial extension. The treatment modalities which we provided prior to enucleation is systemic chemotherapy, both standard and high dose. Focal included transpupillary thermotherapy and some including both TTT with cryotherapy. In enucleation, we perform myoconjunctival technique with ball implant in 37 patients, of which 29 patients were pre-planned at the time of presentation. However, 8 had been performed because of failure to salvage treatment. After enucleation, histopathological high-risk factors were found in 8 patients, of which maximum of them had choroidal invasion. 29% had anterior segment involvement, while 21% had retrolaminar optic nerve invasion, to whom we had provided adjuvant treatment modality like adjuvant chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and 7 patients required both adjuvant and chemo. Adjuvant chemo and radiotherapy. Coming to the outcomes, one of the patient of the study had implant extrusion, 1 presented with the local recurrence, 2 had systemic metastasis, whereas 2 succumbed to death. So status was we had 34 alive patients which were free of disease, 1 is alive with disease, and 2 had succumbed to death. This picture shows our results after enucleation with ball implant with customized ocular prosthesis showing excellent symmetry. So coming to discussion, our study, out of 37, 24 patients were classified in group E with CRF, 2 with group E, and 4 with the group D. Mean number of cycles we have given treatment in systemic chemotherapy was 7.74. 29 patients were presumed to have advanced stage, thus planned for enucleation post chemoreduction. Average time of enucleation from diagnosis was 10.03 months. HRF was found in 8 to 9 patients. 6 patients required adjuvant systemic chemotherapy, 2 were given radiotherapy, and 7 required both. Well, local outcomes, as I told, implant extrusion was seen in single patient.
The longest follow-up post-enucleation surgery is 49 months, mean being 17.86 months. We have compared our study with Zhao et al., Ueda et al., and Itachaya Sakui et al., Berry et al., and Mona et al. Concluding with the presentation, pre-enucleation chemotherapy helps in consolidating the tumor and takes care of possible micrometastasis. Pre-enucleation chemotherapy in advanced intraocular RB did not significantly increase the risk of metastasis, and we report only 5.4% rate of systemic metastasis in our group, where both the cases had presented with extraocular extension of RB at presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Now the next speaker, Anji Jain.
Orbital cellulitis, a nightmare for the ophthalmologist and an agony of pain for the patient. But what if I say it's changing its face from a red painful eye to a painless proptosis? Good morning everyone. Let me take you all through our study on the analysis of meandering trends of orbital cellulitis. Orbital cellulitis has drawn the attention of clinicians since ages due to its propensity to cause sight-threatening infection of the ocular adnexa and ocular tissue. But since the last few years, we have observed a drastic difference in the presentation of patients, the disease outcome, and the management protocols. So with the aim to analyze these trends over the years and to enable practitioners to understand the factors causing these changes, we decided to conduct a retrospective study. We studied 35 patients over a time period of 15 years, which was later subdivided into 3 groups of 5-year interval each. Further analysis was done whether the presentation was primary, that is the first presentation at KGMC, or secondary, that is partially treated elsewhere. Age of presentation, children, adolescent, and adults, assessment of various symptoms and signs, and the possible etiologies was done, as well as the patients requiring a drainage of subperiosteal abscesses were divided into whether we got a wet tap or a dry tap. The collected data was compiled into various charts. In this chart, we can see the most common etiology in children is sinusitis, but the post-dental infection tops the adults. We also noticed a decreasing trend in the post-sinusitis cases and a rising trend in the post-dental infections. Here we can see the frequency of cases in various age groups in all the 15 years is fairly comparable. However, males hold a preponderance over females. We noticed a decreasing trend in the primary presentation of orbital cellulitis and a rising trend in the secondary presentation. And as a mirror to this trend, we noticed decreased number of cases with the wet tap and a rise in number with the dry tap. Regarding the signs and symptoms, we noticed a decrease in trend in the pain and swelling of eyelid, which is a mirror of the primary presentation of orbital cellulitis. We also noticed a rise in proptosis and diminution of vision, which represents the secondary presentation. This is a beautiful chart showing dry and wet tap cases, and we noticed a significant positive correlation between the secondary presentation and the number of dry taps. So our hypothesis was domiciliary treatment with over-the-counter medications in suboptimal doses leads to the relief in acute symptoms of orbital cellulitis, but the underlying disease remains unanswered. This leads to more and more referred cases with complicated symptoms to the tertiary care centers. It highlights the importance of a hospital-based therapy. So we decided to make a working protocol for the primary healthcare physicians, and here is the same. Despite a few limitations, ours was one of the first studies to analyze the secondary presentation and the occurrence of dry tap in orbital cellulitis, and the working protocol made for the primary healthcare physician is the uniqueness of the study. So, we saw a shift in clinical presentation, course of disease and management outcomes, decreasing trend in post-sinusitis orbital cellulitis, and an increasing trend in post-dental infection cases. More and more referred cases with incomplete resolution of diseases are seen. So ladies and gentlemen, are we witnessing a change in trend of the presentation of orbital cellulitis from an acute onset painful proptosis to a painless proptosis? I think yes. What do we take home with us? Orbital cellulitis, a sight-threatening infection. All patients should be admitted no matter what. Mandatory hospital-based IV therapy, close monitoring of response, and need for early referral is the need of hour. Last but not the least, robust primary healthcare services in developing nations to reduce the socio-economic burden caused by these kind of unresolved cases is the need of hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you for finishing on time.
Thank you. So which type of patients you are getting more, primary or secondary?
Sir, over the years we noticed that we are getting more and more secondary presentations. Since we are sitting at a tertiary healthcare center, what is a very common trend, the patients are being treated by over-the-counter drugs, either in their villages or in primary healthcare centers. And we are getting patients which give a history of pain, redness 3 to 4 months back. And now they are coming just with proptosis, and on CT scan we are able to see abscesses which have a thick wall which are very, very difficult to drain. So we saw this trend and we decided to make a study out of it.
Thank you very much. Now the next speaker, Yogita Gupta.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. My topic is red glow sign, a novel sign for detection of calcification in retinoblastoma tumor. I have no financial disclosures and no conflicts of interest. Retinoblastoma is a common pediatric ocular malignancy and intraocular mass lesion detected usually by ultrasonography. Detection of calcification clinches the diagnosis of retinoblastoma, but it may be difficult to discern the calcification. This study describes a novel sign of red glow observed on pediatric white-field retinal imaging system RETCAM3 as a useful tool for detection of retinoblastoma tumor. So aim was to describe this sign, a novel sign for detecting calcification. Its study design was prospective observational case series done at a tertiary care hospital, and cases of retinoblastoma aged less than equal to 5 years attending the specialty clinic and undergoing routine examinations under anesthesia were included. In cases, we found during the EUA, the findings were recorded. Indirect ophthalmoscopy and fundus imaging using RETCAM3 were performed. The calcifications were also confirmed using a conventional B-scan ultrasonography, in which a highly echogenic foci with high amplitude spikes were noted. RETCAM3 was performed for all the participants and findings were noted. So total 40 cases were included. So at different levels of illumination, we noted the RETCAM findings. Mean age was 3.4 years, gender distribution, males 57.5%, and all 100% of eyes demonstrated this sign, that is a light scattering effect, red glow, observed when illumination level of RETCAM3 was raised. The lesions were found to emanate a yellow-white color, as I'll just show in the video. So left, the image is in a low level of illumination, nearly 20 lux units, and the lesion is having a faded appearance. In the right image, you can see a high level of illumination, more than 30. As you can see on the panel of the RETCAM, there is a light scattering and a highly reflective appearance on RETCAM3. More lesions. So A and B are images of the same lesion taken at low and high levels of illumination, and you can see a light scattering effect in image B. Similarly, C and D are also showing similar sign at low and high levels of illumination. This is a video demonstration. Here, the examiner is increasing the level of illumination, and we can see a scattered appearance, a red glow sign which we have described. It is suggestive of an intralesional calcification in cases of retinoblastoma. Another video. Increasing from 0, the illumination level on the panel can be seen, and now 40 level. So here we are seeing a high scattering from the lesion, now reducing it to 20, and at most lesions after 30, they give a huge scattering effect. So intraocular calcification is a diagnostic marker for retinoblastoma. Studies confirm the calcifications are present in nearly 85% of retinoblastoma lesions, and it is a great differentiating point from simulating lesions. And current standard diagnosis is through ultrasonography B-scan. A combination of ultrasonography and fundoscopy is usually done. However, the first line is still MRI. So, in regression of the retinoblastoma lesions, also calcification can be seen. So this is one limitation of my study, that we do not differentiate the appearance of the calcification, how they look in active lesion versus the regressing lesions. So red glow sign was found to be a useful clinical marker for detection of RB tumor with calcification. It hallmarks the presence of intratumor calcification in case of retinoblastoma tumor. Thank you. I acknowledge my retinoblastoma team.
Yogita, I have lots of questions for you. First is, where are you practicing?
I am currently assistant professor at Lady Hardinge Medical College.
Okay, and do you have a red cam there?
No.
So how do you propose that most people like you, me and others who don't have access to a red cam will be doing their retinoblastoma diagnosis? How?
Mostly through ultrasonography and
Mostly
MRI.
through
Clinical evaluation.
right, the clinical evaluation, and then you'll confirm on the ultrasound.
Yes.
Now what you did was you reduced the illumination of the red cam to bring out the calcification, right? You would do the same thing in an ultrasound,
Reduce the gain.
right?
Yes.
You would reduce
No,
the gain.
no, not increase the gain.
You would reduce the gain to do exactly the same thing. You would, like
Yes,
you
yes,
reduce the illumination in your red cam, you would reduce the gain on an ultrasound and get those high spikes which will persist in spite of you having reduced the gain.
Yeah.
So the reflectivity from the rest of the tumor would be reduced, but your spikes would still stand out. Exactly what you did with the red cam. Now what is the difference in price between an ultrasound
Yes.
and a red cam?
So that's a huge difference.
And also,
That's a huge difference, and it's not practical to advise a RedCam 3 for all the institutions, but it's just a sign that we observe. And in EUA, if we have RedCam 3, then no need to go for an ultrasound to reduce the time of EUA. That's it.
is there any comparative analysis you did as with respect to your sign and any false positive or false negatives with respect to ultrasound findings?
Yes, with ultrasound we could get, but 100% was showing this lesion, so the sensitivity.
So all of the patients also showed hyperreflective foci
Yes,
on
yes,
ultrasound?
yes, ma'am.
So what is the value add of the sign?
Thus the
over
time of
ultrasound?
EUA can be reduced in subsequent if we have the RedCam 3, and that is the value of the study.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm sorry we took so much time. We've exceeded the time, but to all the presenters who presented in this session, thank you. It was a very educative experience for all of us. It enriched us all. Thank you for your contribution.